You don't belong here." Those words echoed in the quiet first-class cabin as Victor Harris, dressed in casual clothes, was harshly pulled from his seat. The staff, unaware of who he really was, couldn't have been more wrong. They had just made a mistake that would cost them everything. Victor sat calmly, a man whose wealth could have easily afforded him a life of luxury, but who chose humility over arrogance. He wasn't there to flaunt his power. He was just another passenger, like anyone else, flying to his destination. But that didn't matter to Robert, the senior manager. He looked down at Victor from the moment he boarded, judging him not by his manners, his calm demeanor, or his respectful silence, but by the clothes he wore. Clothes that weren't tailored, weren't designer, weren't the picture of first-class expectations. And so, Robert decided to make a public example of him. "Excuse me, sir," Robert said, his voice cold and dismissive. "This is a first-class seat. We have certain standards here." Victor, who had been quietly reading a book, didn't respond immediately. He didn't react to the rude tone, didn't let his eyes show any sign of anger. He simply placed his book down and looked up. The surrounding passengers stiffened, unsure of what was happening. Some tried to pretend they didn't notice. Others watched intently, curious to see how the situation would unfold. "I'll have to ask you to leave," Robert insisted. "You can't sit here. This seat is reserved for our premium clients." A few murmurs rippled through the cabin, but nobody spoke up. After all, Robert was the authority here. Right? "Let's not make a scene," Robert continued, his voice even colder now. "I'll get someone to escort you to your actual seat." Victor stood up slowly, never once raising his voice, never once showing anger. He could have fought back, could have called attention to the fact that he was not just some ordinary passenger, but the owner of the airline. But that wasn't his style. He left the seat quietly, but there was something in his eyes, something Robert couldn't see, couldn't understand. It was a look that said, "You'll regret this." As Victor moved toward the back of the plane, he didn't say a word to anyone. He didn't ask for assistance or offer a complaint. He simply continued, as if the entire ordeal hadn't affected him. Victor Harris's thoughts raced as he made his way to the back of the plane. His calm exterior hid the storm brewing inside. For a man who had worked tirelessly to build his empire, moments like these always hurt, not because of the disrespect, but because of the ignorance. It was the same ignorance that had followed him his whole life, that had followed every person who wasn't supposed to be in certain rooms, certain spaces. Growing up, Victor had faced countless moments like this. The small slights, the open disrespect, the people who looked at him and made assumptions based solely on his appearance. He had learned early that there were two kinds of battles, those you fought and those you let go. But this wasn't just about a flight attendant or a manager trying to flex power over a single passenger. This was about something bigger, something that had shaped his entire journey. And Victor knew it. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant, his voice steady despite the anger simmering underneath. "Get me the full list of everyone on this flight. I need to know who's in charge here." His assistant, always quick and efficient, responded almost immediately. "Right away, Mr. Harris. I'll have it in your inbox in a few minutes." Victor hung up without saying another word, but the message had been sent. He had never been a man to back down, not when it came to matters of respect, not when it came to standing up for what was right. He didn't need to throw his weight around. He never did. But sometimes, when someone was too blinded by their own arrogance to see the truth, it became necessary. As the plane continued its journey, Victor sat at the back, away from the discomfort of the front, with no one knowing who he really was. And while he was used to the judgment, the sideways glances, the dismissive remarks, it still stung. Robert and his crew had no idea what they'd just done. They had assumed that someone who didn't fit their idea of luxury didn't belong in their world. What they didn't know was that Victor Harris was not just a man with money, but a man with vision, a man who had built an empire from the ground up. And now, they were about to find out what happens when you make the mistake of judging someone based on their appearance. 5 minutes later, the plane began its descent into the destination city. As the seatbelt sign flashed, Victor's assistant had already sent over the information he'd requested. Robert, still smug and unaware, walked down the aisle to check on the passengers. But when he reached the back of the plane, where Victor had been sitting, something was different. Emily, the flight attendant who had been working the section, looked uncomfortable. She knew something was off, but didn't dare ask. She glanced at the door to the cockpit as the plane began to touch down. Before she could even process her thoughts, 2 airport officials entered the plane. They were dressed in formal attire and walked directly toward Victor, who was calmly reading a book again, his posture unshaken. "Mr. Harris," one of the officials said with respect. "Welcome back, sir. We're ready for you now." Robert froze. He looked around at the situation, confused, his heart suddenly racing as he put the pieces together. Victor Harris? The CEO of Sky Globe Airlines? His mind spun. The man he had just humiliated, the man he had tossed aside as someone unworthy of first class, was, in fact, the owner of the very airline he worked for. Victor slowly stood up from his seat. He didn't rush, didn't make a scene. There was no need to. As he passed Robert, he didn't even glance his way. But then he stopped. Turning to face the stunned manager, he spoke with a quiet confidence that made Robert's blood run cold. "Remember when you decided who deserved respect and who didn't?" Victor's voice was calm, but his words cut through the air like a blade. "How's that working out for you now?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Robert couldn't answer. He couldn't find words. He stood frozen, his mouth dry, realizing too late that his actions were not just disrespectful, they were reckless. Victor turned away, heading toward the exit, where more security awaited. But before he reached the door, he stopped again. He turned back to Emily, who had been quietly observing everything with wide eyes. "And you," Victor said, his voice softening. "Thank you for your kindness. You didn't judge me. You didn't make assumptions." Emily blinked, surprised by his words. Her heart, still racing from the tension, began to settle. "You don't need to worry about anything anymore. You're promoted. Enjoy your new position." She stood there, speechless, overwhelmed, as Victor walked past her. It was as if he had just offered her a gift she never expected, a reward for her decency. But there was no time for her to process it. Because Robert, the arrogant manager, had just learned the hardest lesson of his life. The officials led Victor off the plane, and as they did, Robert was left standing there, feeling like the world had just crumbled beneath his feet. Victor Harris didn't look back. There was no need to. As he was escorted through the airport, his mind was already calculating the next steps. The situation with Robert was more than just a minor inconvenience. It wasn't about a seat or a misplaced judgment. This was about something deeper. The systemic issue of people believing they had the right to dictate who belonged where, who deserved respect, and who didn't. For Victor, it was a pattern that had repeated itself for years. Every time he stepped into a room, every time he walked into a business deal, people tried to size him up. It wasn't just the staff on that plane. It was the world. The difference now was that he had the power to change things, not for himself, but for others who had been treated the same way, for those who had been dismissed or mistreated simply because they didn't fit the image society expected them to. As Victor made his way through the airport, his assistant called him again, urgency in her voice. "Mr. Harris, we've got a situation," she said. "I've just heard from our PR team, the staff from the flight. They've been talking. The media's already getting wind of the story." Victor paused for a moment, taking in the information. The story had already started spreading, no doubt exaggerated in ways that would likely paint him as an angry, vengeful CEO. He didn't mind the attention. In fact, he was used to it. What mattered more was what happened next. "I'll handle it. Make sure the media gets our official statement. I want everyone on the same page." Victor didn't need to worry about his public image. That had always been the easy part. What he needed to focus on now was making sure that the people who had crossed the line, who had assumed they could get away with mistreating him because of his appearance, understood the consequences. Back at the airline's headquarters, Robert was in full damage control mode. He had no idea how things had spiraled so quickly. He hadn't realized who Victor Harris was until it was too late. Now, he sat in his office, pacing nervously. His phone buzzed, a call from the CEO. Robert's heart skipped a beat. "Mr. Harris," he said shakily, trying to sound professional despite the fear gripping him. I just wanted to apologize for what happened on the flight. It was an unfortunate misunderstanding." "Save it," Victor interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. "This isn't about an apology, Robert. It's about respect, and I'm afraid you've shown me none." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I never meant to offend you," Robert stammered, desperation creeping into his tone. "I've been with the airline for over a decade, and I don't care about your history, Robert," Victor said firmly. "You made a choice. You chose to judge me based on my appearance, and now you'll face the consequences of that choice." Robert swallowed hard, already knowing what was coming. He had worked his way up the ranks for years, but all of that had just crumbled in a matter of hours. "I'll tell you what's going to happen," Victor continued, his voice calm but firm. "Effective immediately, you're being removed from your position. You'll be replaced, and your severance package will be much smaller than you anticipated." Robert's world seemed to collapse in that instant. He had no words left. He couldn't believe how quickly everything had unraveled. But I've given so much to this company," he protested weakly. "Clearly not enough," Victor replied coldly. "I don't do business with people who think it's acceptable to treat others with disrespect. Not on my watch." The line went dead, and Robert was left staring at his phone, his mind numb. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of the incident were being felt throughout the company. Victor wasn't just making a statement to Robert. He was making a statement to everyone. He had already begun making calls to other staff members, people who had been with the airline for years, people who were loyal and hard-working, but who had also witnessed the treatment of passengers like Victor. Many had already reached out to Victor's assistant, apologizing for the actions of their colleague and voicing their support for the CEO's decision. As for the media, they were eating the story up. Headlines began to pop up, each one more sensational than the last. But Victor didn't mind. He knew the truth would come out in the end. The people who had witnessed the injustice would speak up. He was confident that the world would see this for what it really was, a lesson in humility, respect, and the consequences of judging others. As the days passed, the story continued to dominate the news cycle. The incident was framed in many ways, but the most important thing was the message that was being sent. Victor Harris wasn't just a businessman. He was a force to be reckoned with, someone who wouldn't tolerate injustice, even in the smallest of forms. And the world was watching. In the coming weeks, Robert's firing would make headlines of its own. The news outlets would continue to cover the fallout, and eventually, Victor Harris would make a public statement, one that would resonate deeply with people everywhere. The only thing that truly defines us is how we treat others, Victor said in his address. We all come from different walks of life, but we all deserve to be treated with respect. No one should ever be judged by their appearance or their background. Not in my company, and not in the world. The fallout from the incident had spread across multiple industries. It wasn't just the airline world that had taken notice. The corporate world as a whole was watching what was unfolding. Victor Harris, a man who had built his empire from the ground up, had just sent a powerful message that resonated deeply with those who had long been overlooked, mistreated, or judged by appearances. But while many in the media focused on the drama of the airline incident, Victor had something much bigger in mind. This wasn't about just one bad experience or about firing an employee who had crossed the line. This was a call to action. Victor had always believed in the power of change. His success had never been about playing by the rules. It was about creating a new set of rules, ones that were based on integrity, respect, and the belief that people should be judged by the value they brought to the table, not by their external circumstances. As his phone rang off the hook with media inquiries and business leaders wanting to meet with him, Victor's focus remained clear. He had to take action not just within his own company, but across industries. The time for change was now. Victor was sitting in his office one afternoon, a coffee mug in hand, when he received a call from someone unexpected. Robert. The former manager of the airline had reached out, desperate for a chance to redeem himself. He was frantic, pleading for Victor to reconsider his firing. Mr. Harris, please, I know I made a huge mistake. I was wrong to treat you the way I did. Robert's voice trembled on the other end of the line. I've lost everything. My career, my reputation. I know I can't undo what happened, but I'm asking for a chance to prove I'm better than that. Victor sat back in his chair, thinking about the years he'd spent climbing to the top, never once letting anyone take away his self-worth. Robert, in that moment, wasn't looking for forgiveness. He was looking for validation. The same validation Victor had fought for his entire life. Robert, the decision isn't about giving you a second chance, Victor replied calmly. It's about ensuring this kind of behavior doesn't happen again. The way you treated me that day, that was just a small part of a much larger problem. It's not just you. It's the entire system that breeds this kind of discrimination. That's what I'm focused on fixing. Victor paused for a moment before continuing. If you want to redeem yourself, it's not about trying to get your job back. It's about changing your mindset, truly understanding the people around you, treating everyone with the same level of respect, regardless of their background, their appearance, or their wealth. Robert fell silent, the weight of Victor's words settling in. After a few seconds, he spoke again, his voice quieter now. I understand. I've learned a hard lesson. Victor's tone softened, but his resolve remained firm. Good. Now take that lesson, and make sure you're a part of the change, Robert. Use your position to influence others. This has to be bigger than you or me. Victor ended the call, feeling a slight sense of relief. He hadn't been cold, but he knew that true growth required people to face the consequences of their actions. Forgiveness would only come when someone truly understood the damage they had caused and was committed to doing better. The following week, Victor made a bold move. He held a press conference to address not only the situation with Robert, but also the larger issue of discrimination that was pervasive in industries across the world. The story wasn't about one person or one incident. It was about creating an environment where people were seen for their talents, their values, and their contributions, rather than for what they looked like or how they were perceived. The conference room was filled with journalists, cameras flashing, eager to hear what Victor had to say. The world had been waiting for his next move. What would he do now? Thank you all for being here today, Victor began, his voice steady and powerful. The incident with the airline was not just a personal attack. It was a reflection of the way society has, for far too long, allowed people to be judged by their appearance. It's time we change that. It's time we treat every individual with the respect they deserve, not based on their wealth, their background, or their race, but on the value they bring to the world. The room was silent as Victor continued, his words cutting through the tension. The change starts now. We can't wait for others to make it happen. We must lead by example. I've made the decision to donate a significant portion of my personal wealth to a new initiative, one focused on mentoring and providing resources to underrepresented communities in the business world. It's time we gave people the opportunity to rise based on their abilities, not their appearance. As he spoke, the room seemed to hold its breath. The impact of his words was undeniable. In the days that followed, the press conference went viral. News outlets across the world covered the story, and Victor's message reached thousands, even millions, of people. The power of his words had begun to ripple through the corporate world. Major companies began issuing statements of support for the initiative, promising to take action and ensure that diversity and inclusion were part of their core values. But Victor knew that this was just the beginning. The real work was in the implementation, in making sure that businesses not only talked the talk, but also walked the walk. And he was ready for that challenge. He reached out to key leaders in various industries, from tech to finance, to discuss ways to create real, lasting change. It wasn't about charity, it was about equality, about building a world where people were given the same opportunities, regardless of where they came from or how they were perceived. Victor's influence was growing, and the people who had once dismissed him were now paying attention. He had become a symbol of strength, leadership, and justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated. Victor Harris had sparked a movement, but movements weren't built in a day. The first few months after his press conference were filled with anticipation, collaboration, and, of course, a series of challenges. Despite the global attention his words had generated, the real work was just beginning. He knew that the world had taken notice, but change required persistence, patience, and a level of commitment that went beyond good intentions. The response from the corporate world had been mostly positive. Several companies, particularly in the tech and finance sectors, had already pledged to implement policies aimed at increasing diversity and inclusion. But as Victor had learned from his own experiences, words meant nothing if they weren't backed up with tangible actions. He needed to ensure that these pledges weren't just empty promises. Victor's next step was to take matters into his own hands. He assembled a team of experts, activists, and influencers from various industries to help him spearhead the creation of an organization dedicated to driving long-term change. They called it the Equal Opportunity Initiative. The goal was simple: to advocate for fair hiring practices, provide scholarships for underrepresented communities, and create mentorship programs for those who had the potential to lead but lacked the resources and opportunities to get there. But not everyone was on board. A month after the announcement of the Equal Opportunity Initiative, Victor received a visit from an unlikely source. His longtime competitor, CEO Angela Williams, of one of the world's largest tech companies, Silvertech. Angela had always been known for her sharp business acumen, but she also had a reputation for being tough, even cutthroat. When Victor had started his company, she had seen him as a small-time player who would never pose a real threat. Now here she was, standing in his office with a proposition. "I didn't come here to waste your time, Victor," Angela said as she sat across from him, her piercing gaze never leaving his. "I came to talk about the Equal Opportunity Initiative." Victor raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "Go on." "You've made a lot of noise, and I get it. I do. But I want you to understand something." She leaned forward. "You're playing in the big leagues now, Victor. You can't just throw a few statements out there and expect the world to change. You need allies, not just followers. Silvertech is one of the biggest players in the market, and we have a lot of influence. We could partner with you. Bring your vision to life." Victor studied her carefully. He had always known that Angela was a strategist, but this was different. She wasn't offering help out of the goodness of her heart. She was offering power, leverage. She wanted control. "You want to take this and mold it into something you can control," Victor responded flatly. Angela smiled, her expression almost like that of a predator sizing up its prey. "I don't need control, Victor. I need results. And right now, you don't have the infrastructure to achieve what you want. If we collaborate, I can help you make this happen on a global scale." Victor leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest. He'd always believed that every opportunity came with a price. This wasn't just about doing the right thing. It was about the long-term impact. The Equal Opportunity Initiative was never meant to be controlled by one person, one company. It needed to remain authentic. "I appreciate the offer, Angela," he said slowly. "But this isn't about scale or power. This is about creating real, lasting change. I'm not interested in partnerships that want to take over the cause for their own gain. If you want to be a part of it, you'll need to understand that the mission comes first." Angela's eyes narrowed, but she didn't speak for a moment. Instead, she took a deep breath, as if recalibrating. Finally, she stood up, her expression hardening into one of resolve. "We'll see where this goes, Victor," she said, her voice cold but still holding a trace of respect. "But don't expect me to sit on the sidelines forever." As she walked out of the office, Victor felt the weight of her words. Angela was a formidable opponent, but he wasn't here to play politics. He was here to fight for something far greater than profit margins or corporate power. Weeks passed, and the Equal Opportunity Initiative slowly began to gain more ground. Several high-profile companies had signed on, offering financial support for the scholarships and mentorship programs that were the heart of the initiative. Victor had put together a panel of diverse leaders in business, technology, education, and finance, ensuring that the initiative was truly inclusive in every sense of the word. But the road wasn't without its bumps. The more progress the initiative made, the more opposition it faced. There were those who felt threatened by the changes Victor was pushing for, those who were comfortable with the old systems that kept people in their place. Some accused Victor of using the initiative as a publicity stunt, while others dismissed the movement as too radical. Yet the initiative kept growing, quietly but steadily. One afternoon, Victor received a call that would change everything. "Mr. Harris, this is Robert Greene. I'm with the National Business Association. We've been following the Equal Opportunity Initiative very closely, and I'd like to discuss something important with you." Victor could sense the seriousness in Robert's voice. "I'm listening," Victor replied, his tone steady. "We've seen the backlash, and we've seen the incredible growth. But there's one problem. We're about to introduce a new policy that could undermine everything you've been working on." Victor paused, the air in the room thickening. "What kind of policy?" "A policy that would put limits on how businesses allocate funding to initiatives like yours. It's going to be passed in the next month, and we need to talk before it becomes law." Victor's mind raced. This was the kind of challenge he'd been waiting for, but it was also a dangerous one. If Robert was right, the government was about to move in a direction that could stifle the momentum he had worked so hard to build. "I'll meet with you," Victor said, his voice calm but determined. "We can't let this happen." The conversation with Robert marked the beginning of a new chapter in the movement. Victor realized that to make real, systemic change, he had to confront not just individual prejudices, but institutional power. The Equal Opportunity Initiative wasn't just about giving people a chance. It was about dismantling the barriers that prevented people from having that chance in the first place, and that meant fighting on a larger scale. The next battle was on the horizon, and Victor Harris was ready for it. The weeks following his conversation with Robert Greene were filled with uncertainty. Victor knew that the political climate was shifting, and with it, the very foundation of his initiative was under threat. The policy Robert had mentioned was now being discussed in government circles, and rumors of its passing were circulating. This policy would limit how businesses could support diversity initiatives, effectively blocking companies from participating in movements like Victor's Equal Opportunity Initiative. Victor wasn't one to back down, though. He knew that this fight was far from over, and if anything, the stakes had just been raised. As he sat in his office going through the latest reports from his team, he felt a surge of determination. If they wanted to close doors, he'd find a way to open windows. The fight for equity and opportunity wasn't just a personal battle. It was a societal one, and no policy or law would stop him from pursuing it. He knew that to challenge the policy, he would need to do more than just speak out. He needed to mobilize, to gain support from people who shared his vision, and to create a movement that could not be ignored. Victor gathered his closest allies. Among them were members of the Equal Opportunity Initiative, community leaders, legal experts, and activists. The goal was clear. They needed to build a coalition powerful enough to make the government reconsider its stance on the policy. "It's time to go on the offensive," Victor declared during one of their early strategy meetings. "We're not going to let them strip away the progress we've made." But mobilizing a response wouldn't be easy. Many of his team members were nervous about taking such a bold stance. Some feared that publicly challenging the government might lead to backlash, financial and reputational. Others worried about the political implications, knowing that the policy had strong backing from influential corporate leaders. Victor could sense the hesitancy in the room, but he wasn't backing down. "We have to make our voices heard. We need to show the world that this isn't just about business. It's about justice. It's about fairness." After hours of debate and strategizing, they decided to launch a massive awareness campaign. They would use every platform available to them: social media, press conferences, interviews with major media outlets, and rallies across the country. The message was simple. The Equal Opportunity Initiative was not a trend, and it wasn't something that could be undone by political maneuvering. It was a movement for change that had already started to reshape industries. In the weeks that followed, the initiative's message gained more and more traction. Celebrities, CEOs, and influencers who had supported Victor's cause started speaking out. His team organized a rally in Washington, D.C., bringing thousands of people to the nation's capital to show their support for diversity and inclusion. The rally was electric. People of all backgrounds, races, and creeds came together to stand with Victor and his team. As he stood at the podium, looking out over the sea of supporters, he could feel the power of what they were creating. It was no longer just his fight. It was the fight of thousands, perhaps millions, of people who had been held back by the systems in place. But not everyone was happy with this rising tide. As the rally ended and the crowd dispersed, Victor received a call that changed the course of the entire campaign. It was Robert Greene again. "I've been monitoring the situation closely," Robert said, his voice grim. "The government is set to vote on the policy tomorrow, and it looks like it's going to pass unless we do something drastic." Victor's heart raced. He had known this was coming, but hearing the urgency in Robert's voice made it all feel real. "What's our next move?" "There's one last-ditch effort we can try," Robert said. "There's a loophole in the proposed policy, a legal technicality that could prevent it from being enforced. But we need the backing of powerful figures, business leaders, lawmakers, and even the media to push it through." Victor knew exactly what that meant. They needed an endorsement from someone who could shift the tides, someone who had the power and influence to make the government think twice. His mind immediately turned to Angela Williams, the CEO of Silvertech, who had made her intentions clear months ago. She had always believed in maintaining control, but this wasn't just about control. This was about doing what was right for the future of the business world, for the future of marginalized communities, and for the future of society as a whole. Victor made the call. When Angela answered, her voice was cold, but there was a hint of curiosity in her tone. "What is it, Victor?" "I need your help," Victor said without preamble. "We're on the brink of losing everything we've worked for. The government is about to pass a policy that will destroy the very essence of the Equal Opportunity Initiative. I know you have the power to stop this. I need you to endorse the legal challenge we're preparing." There was a long pause before Angela responded. "Why would I help you, Victor?" "I've already made my position clear." Victor didn't flinch. "This isn't about us anymore. This is about the future of diversity in the workplace, the future of opportunity. If you believe in fairness, in progress, in leading with integrity, then you have to help us." He could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. Finally, she spoke. "Fine," she said, her voice a mixture of reluctance and resolve. "I'll do it. But you better not waste this chance, Victor. You'll have my support. But you need to be ready for what comes next." The next morning, Victor's team went into overdrive. With Angela's endorsement, they were able to gather the support of powerful business leaders, lawmakers, and media outlets. The legal challenge was filed, and a campaign to delay the policy vote was launched. The media buzzed with the news of the unprecedented move, and within hours, the pressure from the public was undeniable. The government, sensing the growing opposition, decided to postpone the vote. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Victor knew they weren't out of the woods yet, but he had learned an important lesson through all of this. Real change didn't come from one person, one company, or one movement alone. It came from people coming together, overcoming their differences, and fighting for a common goal. And with that, Victor Harris knew that the fight was far from over. The battle for equal opportunity had only just begun, and he was ready to see it through.